Hello and welcome to the Challenges Annual Forum session on integrating field perspectives into planning and policy making. I'm Alyssa Jobson, Global Director of Advocacy at the International Crisis Group, and I'm going to be moderating this afternoon's session. Although we don't hear much about it in mainstream media or within international discussions on global warming, it's becoming increasingly clear that climate change is transforming and redefining the global peace and security landscape. From farmer-herder conflicts in East and West Africa to drought and displacement in countries like Somalia and Afghanistan, climate-related security risks are impacting the effectiveness of peace building and threaten the success of peacekeeping missions around the world. In 2020, 6 of the 10 largest UN-led peace operations were located in countries ranked as most exposed to climate change. While missions in Africa make up a large part of these, this affects in other areas in the Middle East, but also in Asia. The impacts of climate change on communities hosting UN and other peacekeeping missions increase inequality and fragility. And if these missions are not sensitive to these dynamics, it can lead to serious grievances. The missions themselves, which have considerable carbon footprints, can contribute to climate change or environmental damage, leading to increasing calls for the greening of blue helmets. However, international peace building and peacekeeping efforts are not currently taking these challenges routinely into account. To discuss these issues, including practical implications that they have in the field, and the efforts that are currently being taken to mitigate climate-related security risks, as well as identify additional measures that we can be taken and opportunities available, we have a really great line of panelists this afternoon. We've got Annette Weber, who's the EU Special Representative for the Horn of Africa at the European Union External Action Service. Sandy Arnold, Chief of Mission Support with the UN Interim Administration in Kosovo. Samuel Gahiga, Political Director at the UN Regional Office for Central Africa. Hazel de Vet, Director, Civil Affairs Division at the UN Mission in South Sudan. And Ngozi Amu, who's team leader of the Senegambia Cluster and Research and Analysis at the UN Office for West Africa and the Sahel. And last but definitely not least, Florian Kramp, Director of Climate Change and Risk Programme at the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute. Before I begin with what I hope is going to be a lively and frank discussion, I have a few housekeeping notices. First of all, this panel is on the record. It is being live streamed on Challenges Forum YouTube channel, and it's also being recorded. If you'd like to ask any of our panelists a question, you can do so by using the Q&A function. We'll try to address as many of your questions as we can, but we may not be able to get to them all. So I apologize for this in advance. So to kick off today's discussion, I'd first like to explore the link between climate change and conflict. So I'd like to ask Florian initially, in what ways do you think that climate change impacts and conflict and political instability in fragile states?
Yeah, thank you so much, Elisa, and thanks for having me at the panel and contributing to this discussion. I want to start off with a side note. I think this is really important and really exciting that this topic is reaching a forum like the Challenges Forum, well known in the peace operations world. I remember 2 years ago, I tried to do a session at the Stockholm Forum that we are hosting on the issue, right? And it was an uphill battle and really difficult. And I think now we have come really a long way. And I think part of that is that the understanding of climate security and how climate-related security risks are impacting countries, societies, but also peace operations has come a really, really long way. So what research shows us that we are doing, for instance, at CEPRI is that the double burden of climate change and conflict is increasingly compounding the hardship of already highly vulnerable populations. And that's exactly the context that peace operations and special political missions are operating in, right? You referred to the numbers before. 6 out of the 10 largest UN peace operations are happening in highly climate exposed areas. And it is 80% of all deployed UN personnel that is in these regions, right? So it is absolutely important and pivotal that we are considering this in such a forum. What the research shows us very clearly, and where I think we have come to large degree to a consensus by now, while still a lot of research needs to be done for a lot of regions that are underexplored, but we come to an understanding that climate change increases the risks of violence and conflict. But climate change is not the only cause, right? We shouldn't fall for the illusion that climate change is the only thing in town. All the contexts we're operating in are so complex and complicated. There are many root causes and factors that we need to consider. So context matters. That means also, which makes it more difficult for us, that the same climate phenomena and climate impact in one region, for instance, in Somalia, will not play out the same way in Mali. It will not play out the same way in South Sudan, and it will be probably really different in Kosovo, right? That is something we need to consider. So the political, social, and economic and geographic context matter how these things play out. But I think what we know is leaving climate and environmental factors out of risk analysis will omit important impacts that these factors have on local, national, and even regional security, and that leaving climate change out of our conflict analysis means that our analysis is incomplete. We heard it before, the security context is changing, climate change is changing the landscape for peace operations, but it is also changing what it means to build peace. And that means we need different and new responses. Thank you.
Thanks, Florian. I was wondering perhaps whether Annette and then maybe Samuel could perhaps give us some examples of what climate's impact is having on the regions that you focus on. So for you, Annette, it's the Horn of Africa. For you, Samuel, it's Central Africa. You know, how is climate manifesting itself in the security problems that your regions are facing?
Thank you, Lisa. And a very good question. I think what we've seen
we can't hear you very well actually at the minute, Annette. Maybe you can get a bit closer to the microphone.
Okay, sorry. Is it better now?
Yes, that's better.
Okay. Thank you for the question, Elisa. And I think what we've seen in the Horn of Africa, definitely starting with the war in Darfur many years ago, is exactly what Florian was referring to. A mix of indicators and a mix of root causes, but climate change being one of it. Not so much because there was less fodder for the animals, but because of various factors, for example, drought, climate change induced drought, and more animals came together. And I think these two factors definitely led to a very stressful situation in Darfur, where basically mobilizing forces to get more pasture was something that we've seen, playing out in a terrible conflict. We do see this currently in Abyei. And of course, right now, if you look at North Kenya and Somalia, it's quite clear. So I think that, as Florian said, the root causes connected with climate change are seen in the Horn of Africa, basically in every conflict that we're talking about. However, how to detangle this and how to also have more of a preventive approach. Maybe we come to this later, but I think this is really where it's important, because we do know climate change will change the landscape also for conflict. So what can we do to prepare and to prevent? Thank you.
Yeah, I think those are really important questions, and hopefully we will be getting to them later on in this session. But Samuel, can you tell me, how does climate change, how is it impacting conflict in the region that you work on?
Thank you. First of all, I would like to add that to clarify that for Regional Office for Central Africa, it's since 2019 that the UN Security Council has asked us to focus more specifically on the climate drivers of conflict in across the region. And definitely, as Florian was saying, it's actually high time that we look at it from a peace building perspective, because there's no efforts on conflict prevention without looking at that through that particular lens. Just to give a few indication, while Central Africa, we cover 11 countries, ranging from the country Angola, which has encountered severe droughts in the past couple of years, for the first time in 40 years, up to Lake Chad, where you have the Lake Chad, which is also drying gradually, and the Congo Basin, which is actually the first net carbon sink worldwide, actually. So, we have this diversity of environments. Yet, I think for only 2020, last year, we saw the number of IDPs related to climate change rising to 4.3 million in sub-Saharan Africa. And for Central Africa, I would mention Burundi, where 83% of the IDPs last year were actually caused by natural disasters, and mainly the rise of the lake Tanganyika. And in Congo, DRC, 280,000 of the new IDPs were basically caused by natural disasters. So just to say that we can no longer keep that aspect of the climate driver of conflict and potential conflict or instability silent. And I think that's why and I'll mention that later probably, but we are actively working with the regional organization here, ECAS, ICGLR, but also, of course, with our colleagues in Dakar, and Ngozi will mention that certainly later, to see how all the analysis that we are conducting, be it on maritime security, be it on farmer headers, actually stems from basically incorporating the climate dimension in our analysis. So I'll stop here for now. I don't know if I explained clearly, but we can actually come back later to some aspects. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Samuel. And Ngozi, are you seeing similar patterns in West Africa?
Yes, thank you very much, Lisa. Absolutely. I think both the West Africa region and the Central Africa region, we are experiencing very similar impacts of climate change. Of course, as Florian said earlier, it's important that we think of this in context. So even if you look at one country, you can have certain areas within that country that is more affected than others. So for example, if you look at Niger, Burkina Faso, Mauritania, Mali, there are certain areas, especially bordering the Sahelian region, which are more affected than others. And I think it's important also to point out that, at least in West Africa, about 60 to 70% of the population, they depend on rain-fed agriculture and livestock rearing for survival. So we're really talking about a large part of the population that is dependent on natural resources and the earth and the water for survival. So when these weather changes happens, it really hits very hard in terms of survival. So we talk about this concept of human security. So the security is not just physical security, but it's also having access to food and water and health and school, anything that an individual needs to survive. And that's why the approach in the UN Office for West Africa and the Sahel, we cover 17 countries, has been to really look at this from the standpoint of populations who are experiencing these heat waves and sandstorms and sea level rises and flooding, and ask ourselves, what do they want? And we have done risk assessments to find out. And from these risk assessments, at least 3 things have stood out so far. One of them is these conflicts that have existed and have been increasing for the last decade between farmers and herders. And that's obviously this competition, having access to water and land. But this competition, and I think the word competition is very important, because this is what happens when there are less resources because of climate-induced factors to compete. So the second finding that we've seen is that even in terms of social cohesion and building trust in communities, it's had an impact in certain places that are most vulnerable to climate change. And then thirdly is this issue about migration and relocation. And I think that there's a big chunk of work being done by the World Bank, for example, on that, trying to look at where will people move in places where it becomes too difficult, too hot, too dry, too impossible to stay, and where will they move and how will they be received by the host communities? And just to end, I want to say, obviously, that climate change is one factor among many. We're talking about insecurity, we're talking about, poverty and all these different issues. But in this region, what we've seen is that climate change is one factor where it seems that there is less that populations themselves can do to turn it around. So it's a lot about adaptation. But there's a whole lot of adaptation that can be done. And there are lots of positive examples that I can mention in the second part of this session. Thanks.
Thanks very much, Ngozi, and to Samuel and Annette for sort of laying out some of the issues in Africa. I want to turn now to Sandy and Hazel, who both work in UN missions, and I'd be interested to hear from you. How specifically climate and environmentally related security risks are affecting the work of your work in these peacekeeping missions. So Sandy first and then Hazel, thanks.
Thank you very much first to Almut and Pernilla and the teams for this very interesting event. And I'm humbled and honored to be with such a great group of people. Here in Kosovo, the climate challenges that we face are water shortages, heat waves, drought, flooding, as well as illegal logging of forests. Yeah. In addition, the electricity production is done by two coal power plants. In peacekeeping, just to clarify for the audience, the budget and the mandates we get is my role as Chief Mission Support. I also wear the hat of the chair of the Global Energy Environmental Group for peacekeeping. Is that our budgets are given and I provide support for mandate implementation to my internal clients. Now, regarding are we at the table for the with local authorities and with the UN Kosovo team, is there a plan in the future? What is our role? I think there's a lot of room for improvement in this regard. And I think around the table, COVID-19 has impacted all of us. So I'm very excited to get some ideas from this forum that I can take back with me and have discussions with my leadership and see how we can make a positive impact and work towards a positive legacy. Thank you.
Thanks, Sandy. And Hazel, what challenges are you facing in your work in South Sudan?
Good afternoon, everyone. And like my colleague Sandy, equally very excited to form part of this particular panel and on this important topic. Maybe as part of my context setting, just to give you a snapshot of the existing conditions that we are having in South Sudan, and then how that actually relates to impacting the work that we are required as the peacekeepers in the country. Let me start off by saying that 95% of the population relies heavily on very consistent climate conditions, which is basically meaning rain-fed agriculture and pastoralism. What we've had for the past consecutive 3 years is the worst rainfall in 60 years in South Sudan, and it's affecting over 800,000. It's affecting 8 out of the 10 states. And what we've experienced ourselves now is that your cattle herding populations are now encroaching on smaller areas in order to maintain their livelihoods. And this is obviously causing increased tensions between the farmers, the cattle herders, and a much more smaller resource environment in terms of water and dry land. And this obviously creates a great deal of attention. But let me also explain to you, it's not only that the communities are vastly affected. One of our states in Unity, we've had to use our horizontal engineering capability to ensure that we build dikes and have the actual flooding drained so it wouldn't directly come into the UNMI space and therefore affecting our ability to continue with our mandated task. And so the question comes out, are we agile, able to undertake these different experiences, especially the floods? South Sudan doesn't have a lot of tar roads. And so we've had to use our engineering, and we're unable to land in areas so as to access community that are in need of our protection mandate. So it clearly gives us an understanding that as we go forward, for example, our APCs, just as a won't be able to access those areas. So what we've had to undertake in South Sudan is very quickly, I'm explaining to everyone, we've had to build the plane while flying it all at the same time. I think what I'd like to bring out here is that there is no time for us to engage in appropriate preparations so that we can deliver on multiple tasks, given the impact that it has on populations. And so that's one of the key things that I'd like to present here. The second thing, we've included into our mandate now a responsibility to address particularly climate security in what we do in terms of our peace operations. Being a novice in this area, Mission looked at it and said, since you are dealing with the people on the ground and looking at conflict-affected communities, so therefore, Hazel Devad, you will be the focal person. And so I'm very much happy to be part of it so that this novice can gain an understanding from what's happening out there. And I think I'll stop for here now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Hazel. Oh, and Sandy's pleased. I think she wants to make a plea for more attention to be brought to this issue. And I think, you know, your image there of having to sort of make the plane at the same time that you're trying to take off is really stark. And, you know, it goes back to this point that I was saying earlier that you know, that there isn't enough international attention on this particular aspect of climate change and the impacts that it has globally. Florian, I wondered whether or not, you know, what we're talking about here and what Hazel began to touch on, I think, is greening peace operations. You know, what can you maybe give us some suggestions of what can be done to make peace operations, peacekeeping operations, the political missions that UN has, and you know, other missions, better for the environment. You know, maybe have a smaller footprint on the environment, but also help the communities that are hosting them deal with these climate-related issues. So, Florian, over to you. A big question, I know.
Yeah, thank you so much. And you asked the right person, because greening the peace operations isn't my favorite topic. No, but I think it's a really important topic, right? And it's rightly getting the attention, and it's relatively uncontroversial if you look at the broader discourse within the UN, I think, around climate change and those impacts. So reducing missions footprint absolutely needs to be done. And specifically when you add in the second part of your question at the end, when you look at the impact and on people and helping people, we saw that in the research we did in Mali, right? And MINUSMA, and how a compound and all the needs that a compound somewhere in northern Mali has by accessing water resources, you're withdrawing, you're reducing the water table of the groundwater table significantly, which means the village next door doesn't have access to groundwater anymore, right? Or it's much more difficult. You're depleting the resources. And obviously people will be upset, and it doesn't help you trying to become more popular and sort of you're in a lot of places anyway already facing the reluctance of the local population. So it doesn't help. And we saw, I guess, the extreme case of that in Haiti with the cholera outbreak, right? So there's no way around reducing that footprint and being smarter about it. But the key is, and I think that is a really important thing, is, and Sandy, that was great that you mentioned the power plants in Kosovo, because we wrote about that a couple of years ago. And I always ask myself, like, you're spending so many millions on refurbishing old lignite power plants instead of investing that into something progressive, future-oriented, diversifying the energy sector, right? I think that is what we need to understand. We cannot come to the point where doing climate change and doing greening the blue and reducing the footprint is just another thing we do. It is actually part of the story, right? It is part of what we do, because climate action, if you think about it, is peace building and is development. If you need to understand that, it's not separate things. So instead of doing three things of different agencies and different actors, and we don't know what one is doing and what the other is doing oftentimes, we need to increase that coordination. We need to understand we're operating in a different field. We need to bring these factors together and understand that, well, if you do one thing well, if you do climate adaptation in a case well, it will have peace dividends. Now, here's a catch. We need to understand what those are. And in a lot of cases, we see the potential of that, right? Of bringing renewable energy to a community and on the one hand, powering the compound with that and having an oversupply of energy and can support the nearby communities. But we actually need to understand what that impact is. Are we actually generating a peace dividend? Are we actually generating peace? And like Ngozi mentioned, the impacts on social cohesion are important. Can we actually do these things in a way that enhances social cohesion, that builds trust between peace operations and the communities? And we overall come to such a more synergetic picture. So we shouldn't just stop at sort of, like, well, now the military part or the operational part, the cars are running on this, but actually think far ahead and think really innovative what the options are, what possible solutions can be, because we're spending so much money and so much resources already. So why not invest them into something that is really future oriented?
Thanks, Florian. I don't know, Sandy, Hazel, whether you have a response to that, especially Florian's criticism of your power plant.
Look, I have strong views, and I'll try my best to be diplomatic. So, Florian, thanks for the challenge. Look, there's good news out there, yeah, but you need to understand the context. Okay, what do we have? What are we doing? And where do we need to go? I'm a peacekeeper now, 22 years. Very proud peacekeeper, served all around the world, including with Hazel several times, God help me. Yeah, and I think we are doing good work. But as an operational person, you need to realize that in peacekeeping, for us to be able to implement the mandate, we still need to flush the toilet, drink the water, have the electricity. Now, the current model that we have, it's the best that we have. Can it be improved? Our feet are made to move forward. Everything should be looked at and continuous improvement. In this regard, what is the Chapeau document? Yeah, so we have the UN UNSCAP of 2019, and the targets for 2030, 2050 are very clear. Yeah, all of you guys are going ahead and quoting the large peacekeeping missions. We're producing 20 to 30% of the electricity consumption. Then the question will be, how are we with the other international actors, with the host country? What is the future plan are we working towards? Yeah, and that's the elephant in the room. This is not under our Secretary General's overall power. This is a national ownership, and we will need to contribute towards this. Sounds good. Our mandates, are subject to UN Security Council approval, and our budgets are for 1 year. So if we're talking about a strategy, we need to be in the same room with the peacekeepers, with the peace builders, with the development parties, and we all compete for the same resources. Okay, so as a peacekeeper, what am I proud of? Yeah, I'm very proud of that under the UN blue flag, we are serving in POC challenges, human rights, DDR, we're doing capacity building, child protection, yeah? And we're trying to ensure the safety and well-being of UN personnel are there based on the rules and regulations, which we have minimum standards, no matter what we need to provide for them to go out and do their work. Now, the Department of Operational Support since 2017, before the management reform, has a 6-year environmental strategy. Yeah, I'm the chair of the Global Energy Working Group, and there's great progress that we have made in phase 1. What have we done? If you remember anything from this panel, data is power. Yeah, look at the data. Where do we start in 2017? Where are we now? We can show all the statistics regarding development of environmental action plans for each peacekeeping mission, development of of energy infrastructure management plans, development of e-application based on 5 criteria, many key performance indicators. Out of 100, I'm pleased to note UNMIC is 89, but look, we're in a frozen conflict. We're in Europe, also called the Balkans, all right? But we don't have at UNMIC the challenges that Hazel is facing in South Sudan. Yeah, that Samuel is facing in Central Africa. We don't. So we can work on our quality and improvements. Regarding solar and the tools we have at hand, look, after the management reform, and this is for member states and your think tank people out there, ask us for accountability and enforcement. Each peacekeeping budget, I go ahead and I defend my own budget, my own performance. Yeah, the cross-cutting of how much electricity are you guys all producing does not exist. How much money you are paying for water, for boreholes, does not exist. Ask for this data, so then we can talk about our performance in the future. Capacity building within peacekeeping of our people, we have invested in it. Yeah, we have environmental officers reporting directly to decision makers. Our environmental action plan is part of the SRSG, the Special Representative Secretary General's Compact now. So we are being held accountable, but at the silo level, and the management reform is great. I can make decisions with my leadership at the local level. But if you're asking, can I help with some money? I have Hazel, if she has any priorities from UNMIC to UNMISS, this does not exist. It was proposed, it did not fly with member states, okay? I think I will stop there. Regarding the other elephant in the room, that we need to have more robust coordination with UN country teams, more partnerships with member states, with other organizations. Progress has been made. There's the September 2021 agreement with IRENA. But again, we are serving in places where environment is not and climate is not the top priority. Survival and access to basic rights are the priorities in conflict and post-conflict areas we are serving. But to pick up on the theme, what is the story we want to leave behind? We should work towards knowing our limitations and strengths in peacekeeping. We should work towards the exit strategy. And perhaps we are working in the right direction if now we're adding climate security mechanism kind of language into the mandates. But then that's another elephant in the room. We get the mandate, but not enough resources. Yeah. With that one, I will turn the hand grenade over to Hazel, my dear.
Thanks, Hazel. Yeah, I mean, it'd be interesting if you could let us know. I mean, presumably you're facing the same challenges that Sandy has outlined there, but you know, in a context that is more difficult than the Western Balkans.
Yes, and I, based on our earlier discussion, I will be forward-looking to go through all of the challenges that we have in South Sudan. I don't think we're going to get much out of it because we have just about nothing here. So no tar roads, no clean drinking water, no electricity, etc., etc. And I don't think it's going to be worthwhile. But what is it that we are doing and how are we going about this? Because it's here to stay, as I said. We have now a UN-wide working group that is based on what we call the triple nexus information, bringing together our development partners, our humanitarian partners, and our peace building. And it's a UN-wide working group that is co-chaired by myself and UNDP. I'd like to extend my sincere appreciation to the Irish, who provided us with $1 million. And this is now allowing us to bring in dedicated capacity, because we have to bring the science on board alongside with the ideas around the security element within peacekeeping. For myself, I do understand the security dynamics because that's our bread and butter. But I do need dedicated capacity where the climate change / adaptation processes can then form part of what we would like to develop. So hopefully in a couple of months, anyone out there, there is a senior advisor position that's coming on board. Hopefully within the next week or so, UNDP contract, you will be working, having direct reporting responsibility, first to peacekeeping as well as to the UN country team. We've been able to look at a whole of mission approach about how we go. So that is what we do in relation to looking at the issues of climate security, climate change and security vis-a-vis the communities and our mandated task. And then so we're bringing, we don't have UNEP, for example, available. UNDP's got some consultancy that they are bringing on capability, as well as FAO. And within the next couple, I would like to be, I'm very optimistic and seriously ambitious. We will be having a UN strategic document that will look at the triple nexus on how we address climate change and security within us. So this is ability for us to work against the siloed. We have the big elephant in the room, that is peacekeeping. But also we are looking, as Sandy mentioned, there is real keen interest to look at our footprint in South Sudan. And so we are looking at renewables. We have been able to engage with WFP. So we're bringing on these big, crazy Sherpas so we can be able to go out within these flood affected areas. But like my friend and colleague Sandy said, we have a zero budget. We are being creative with what we have, but it is not sufficient. And I think here we are looking at alternative funding streams and how we can join up as the UN in order to work much closer with the government of South Sudan. The government, we've known about the conflict, the recent communal, political conflict that existed. So now we have to do both policy setting as well as capacity building. And it just goes back to my earlier comment about how we, as well as drawing down to seriously affected communities. You have a country where 75% of the population is under 30 years. And so there are huge, huge challenges vis-a-vis the youth. We are specifically looking at the impacts that the climate change and security has in terms of the youth and women. And I think I'll stop here. Over to you.
Thanks, Hazel. Would definitely like to return to this question of youth and women, and the impact that climate security is having on them, but we'll come back to that a bit later. I mean, one of the elephants that Sandy mentioned was the fact that, you know, there's not great communication across agencies within the UN system. I mean, I'd be interested to sort of hear from particularly those of you in the central in the big political missions like Samuel and Ngozi, about, you know, what you can do to sort of help foster this kind of exchange. But then also from Annetta, you know, how can the EU work better with the UN in these areas? You know, how can we encourage more cross-agency engagement, more knowledge sharing, more exchange? Samuel, over to you first.
Thank you so much, and I think it was really super interesting to hear Sandy and Hazel speak about the specificities of Kosovo and South Sudan in terms of the challenge sometimes with the host country. I think Sandy referred to that. Because probably one of the main challenges is also to have a common understanding across 11 countries when it comes to Central Africa, agreeing on the urgency of climate security being one main topic that they should look into, and building up the resilience of their own states to those climate shocks in a more regional approach, having some frameworks at regional level. So what we did as UNOCA, I think for the past year and a half, we've been conducting a three-step study on the impact of climate and on peace and security in the region. And I think with the close support of our DPPA colleagues in New York. And from that, I think we've managed to identify several aspects affecting your urbanization, armed groups, and various clusters. And building on that, we had a meeting last Friday with the ministers of the 11 countries of Central Africa, who gathered in Libreville in the context of the UN Standing Committee on Peace and Security Issues in Central Africa. It's a committee established back in '92, but it's only since 2019 that they've started looking at climate as a key issue related to security. So the first thing is making sure that those 11 countries have a common understanding. Second is to see how we can actually help build a regional framework that commits all those countries to addressing the medium to long-term effects of climate change on peace and security. And for that, I think I'm going back to your question, Elisa, about how to mobilize the UN family, the UN partners. I think part of the study that we are conducting is really to reach out to all 11 UN resident coordinators and UN country teams in the region, and seeing really what's having a mapping of what's done in the area of environment support, environment governance, and see really how we can actually have a common approach, a common strategy to address those effects. And it's actually ongoing. This morning, we had a meeting with the RCs from the region actually to advance this reflection. And the idea would be at the end, probably sometime in 2022, being able to come up with a regional framework that would be endorsed by ECAS, the regional organization here in Central Africa, and really having all the countries with the RCs, with the country teams and other partners. Of course, Annette, we're working here closely with the EU, our EU counterparts, seeing really how we can all come together to really address those challenges. Because as I was saying, not all countries in the region take climate as seriously. I mean, of course, we have Gabon and Congo, who are actually the host of, and DRC was the host of the Congo Basin, and others who are more like in the deserts, like in the Sahel, like Chad. So I think having all those countries come together is quite a challenge, but that's what we are working on. And last, I would say, we were talking about adaptation. I think here, the meeting last Friday was interesting because they were saying basically, we are the less polluters. I mean, we pollute less, but I mean, we are also the biggest victim of climate change. So one way is also to see how, at the UN, we can also play a better role in advocacy to make sure that we help countries of the region build coherent and governance-oriented strategies that would actually meet the commitment that they have also made earlier in the COP26 in Glasgow. And one last point is also to see how, as a UN partners and others, we can help also build up the capacities of the region on early warning. Because I think all of that comes to really how can we anticipate future natural disasters. And I think that's where I think we can all play a collective role with our UN, other UN actors, including in the development and humanitarian area. Thank you.
Thanks. Annette, could you come in and perhaps maybe talk about how the EU can work and how it is working with other agencies in the Horn in particular?
Yes. Let me use an example that is not necessarily connected to peace missions, to peace operations, but let me use an example, the GERD and the Nile, to basically see what's not going so well, but where potentially a bigger awareness of climate change as a trigger and more innovative cooperation and multilateral approaches could actually be, a way out. So the EU has been engaged on the Nile for 20 years now. Member states and EU have been spending more than 100 million on trying to not only be part of or guarantors of the mediation, but also trying to get away from just looking at a problem that is, for example, the GERD, a dam, but looking into potential solutions together with UNDP and with others, potential solutions of the Nile, the growing demography. We know that the population might double in the next 30 years. We know the Nile water is scarce. We also, we have trigger points such as mass agricultural schemes using a lot of water where basically the quota is not there. So I think these are trigger points piling up in a region where basically 2 out of 3 of these countries affected also have conflicts, amongst themselves, but also specifically right now Sudan and Ethiopia, basically at least Ethiopia bordering on civil war, where water and the national symbolism of water, energy, and survival is closely connected to let's say, conflict, warfare narratives. And I think this is where it's important to look into the future rather than just, let's say, staring at a dam. And I think this is where we are discussing issues such as energy, needs of energy in a growing population. What kind of alternatives do we have? What kind of, alternatives for Ethiopia specifically in terms of sun, solar, thermic, other ways of energy? What kind of ways of water management can we have for Sudan for the big agricultural schemes? And of course, also what kind of water management and fresh water can we have for Egypt? And I think these are issues that are, of course, currently discussed, but the 3 countries feel like looking at the dam is closer to their concern because they wish that things can just be solved by, turning on and off the tap. But of course, that's not the case. And I think this is where it's not just preventive diplomacy, not just preventive discussion, but also trying to really get from the dam that, of course, has to be solved into the larger issues, the conflict triggers, the potential ways out, but also looking at the trigger points, as we said, in terms of migration, in terms of people that will flee because water is running out. So it shouldn't just be of concern of these 3 countries. It should be of concern to a much larger audience. And I think these are a couple of issues where we do cooperate quite well, but the political decision making, of course, is also needed. I think we're doing better on the Red Sea. But I think this is where basically questions of environment are now coming in that are of interest to all littoral states. so it's not the hardcore, aspects of survival that, for example, Egypt is raising when it comes to the Nile. So I think using examples to cooperate and communicate, like the Baltic Sea Cooperation, we're basically starting with issues that are of common interest and that can be solved, for example, environment, rather than looking into maritime security as hard issues of security, where we will not see, lines of interest so quickly. I think these are issues that we need to tackle in a multilateral way, and I think this is where the AU lead on the GERD, but also the potential lead of the Saudi Arabian Red Sea Council could be examples of how to bring these different aspects together and get out of just looking at one trigger, but looking into the potential various solutions. But at the end, of course, it's not going to bring the quota. It's not doubling the volume of the Nile. So it has to be dealt with in a different way. Thank you.
Thanks, Annetta. Ngozi, would you like to come on this question?
Sure, yes, a couple of points. Very interesting discussion from colleagues. And I think what Sam said earlier about the need for humility to approach this, because it's all quite new for us, and it also has some technicalities to it, climate change. But I think for our office, us, we have a Security Council mandate. And I think that has really helped to have a council mandate that specifically sort of encourages this office to do specific things. So we are asked to look at the adverse implications of climate change in two ways: the risk assessments that I spoke about before, and then turning these risk assessments into risk management strategies. And obviously this takes the whole UN family. And so I think the idea of integration, I think Hazel was emphasizing this earlier, I think never has it been a time as now when you need an integrated approach to address complex issues such as the impact of climate change on human security. And so for us, we've established a UN working group, a regional working group in this region with the whole UN family. And I think that's important too, because the purpose is not for everyone to start doing, we are a political office, we cannot become experts on environmental issues, but we have to learn how to integrate different methodology, different questions to ask, different interlocutors to speak to, maybe having joint meetings where we meet with government and ministries and so on. And then we have a second working group, which is with ECOWAS, the regional counterpart here in the region. And that's extremely important because one thing we realized is that they have a track already where ECOWAS is supporting the 15 countries that form part of their body to put in place these national climate change adaptation plans, in addition to the NDCs, which is for the Paris Agreement. And so we see a direct link with the research or the risk assessments we are doing in the field. How can we take the results from there, what the population is saying to us about the issues? How can we feed that into the policy development that ECOWAS is supporting to national government? Because ultimately, I think, the end users of this is we are supporting the governments of this region and the people of this region. So the UN has a support structure in this regard. And then I wanted to end just to say, because I spoke about climate change as a risk multiplier, but I think all these, and I think the key word again is competition for less resources. And the more we have climate shocks, the less, we have water and available land. So how do you turn competition into collaboration? And I think we see multiple examples in the region where that is already happening. And I think this is where we need support. How do you plant trees? How do you reinvigorate the soil? How do you support the women in some of the extraordinary work actually that UN Women is doing for this resilient climate work? And there I want to point out, apropos of women, that if 60 to 70% of the population in West Africa are farmers or pastoralists, 80% of the agriculture force are women. So you're really saying if you want to do something, you should be supporting the women. And they have local ideas, and those ideas need some modernization in some areas. They need to be scaled up in other areas. But also, I think there's some solutions that are just quite frankly being there to ask them what they need. And so I think this is the positive side. And we are at this point, us working together with the whole UN family and with ECOWAS, we're planning a conference actually with the support of Ireland and also indirectly with Norway and Sweden and other to really take the findings of this risk assessments and then move ahead, as I said, toward policy development, and then look at how we can rely on different UN expertise to support the governments in the region. And so I think, again, this is also, since I've heard others calling out to the donor community, I mean, there are things you can support in terms of the regional working groups we have, supporting this opportunity to actually use our different knowledge in different UN agencies to have this integrated approach. So I think that there are many, many positive ways we can make this happen. Thanks.
Thanks, Ngozi. And yeah, I mean, and thanks for that. Look forward to what we can do, and that sort of ties into one of the questions that we've got from the audience. So I've got a few questions here. I'm just going to read them out, and then I'll wait to see which of our panelists would like to answer them. So one question we've had is, it sort of says that the international community has essentially failed in the global response to COVID-19, and feels that this bodes ill for action on climate change and security. So what can UN field presences do to ring the alarm bell to convince governments, private sector and others of the urgency of climate change and security? I mean, I think, Ngozi was just starting to ring that bell, and I think we've heard Sandy and Hazel do that as well. But, if there are any other things that you think we should be calling on, whether that's the governments in the countries themselves, international community, or the UN directly, and especially the UN Security Council, which has come up a couple of times, I think, in this discussion. What can the UN Security Council do? Another question that we have is specifically on the topic of greening peacekeeping and renewable energy, and how that can, a transition to that can fit into broader climate security landscape in the field. And we heard from Hazel how difficult these challenges are for them in South Africa. But the questioner wants to know what else, also what other challenges are facing the field in increasing the adoption of renewables, and maybe that's something Florian, you could perhaps talk about as well. We've had a question from Kristen Petillon, who wants to know how do you plan to integrate climate change into your planning, both in terms of political analysis and when it relates to the actual establishment of presences in the field. She says that this requires a different set of knowledge, in non-traditional knowledge, technical expertise with weather forecast, disaster risk reduction, and how are you planning to integrate this into your planning? Maybe Florian, you've not had a chance to speak for a while. Are there any of those issues you'd like to address?
Yeah, can you repeat the one on the renewables that you wanted me to? On
the renewables, it's how does the renewable energy fit into the broader climate security landscape, and what are some of the challenges in the field that the field faces in the adoption of renewables?
Yeah, okay. I think probably the colleagues can talk much more about that, because they are facing that challenge, of course, in the field. I think what I would add there is we need to see it as an opportunity, right? That we need to diversify the energy sector in most of the countries we're affected by or dealing with. And we need to see that as an opportunity in leading us also in the bigger transition, right? We're also, I mean, another challenge aside from what we are talking here about the specific context of peace operations is that we globally will go through or have to go through an energy transition, right? And how can we, or that transition will bring a lot of winners and losers. How can we manage that transition in a peace and just way? I think that can be one way to bring in. But I would like to counter a little bit. I mean, I fully agree with the question that Kristen raises, that this requires different set of knowledge. But actually, I want to take that on also. It actually doesn't, right? And I think that was mentioned before. We do not not everyone in missions need to become a climate security expert, and it's not possible, right? And Gozi mentioned that, I think Hazel mentioned that too. And that's absolutely right. What we need is make the linkages, make the connections in people's heads, right? We see that in the research that we do on for instance, in MINUSMA. Protection of civilians officers are telling us, well, we don't do climate change, and it's not really a problem for us. It's not really an issue. And then you dive a bit deeper, and 10 minutes into conversation, you're like, yeah, well, we're seeing seasonal trends in the violence against civilians. And yeah, actually they have to do with employment in the agriculture sector. And actually that has to do with when the rain season comes. And making that connection that when the rain season comes has a lot to do with climate change in the meantime, right? And it doesn't require that the protection of civilian officers become a climate expert on like this year we will see a 5-degree anomaly of whatever. That's not what's needed, right? We need to know this year the rain season is coming 3 months late, or it's going to be a much drier year. It's going to be a much wetter year. That is the information that we need. And then having these connections made, I think is all we need, which also takes a little bit of pressure out of people, yeah, right? It feels daunting to deal with this topic, but actually it comes down to, well, is it drier, wetter, hotter, colder? That's in the end of the day, the key information that we need.
Thanks, Florian. Sandy, would you like to respond to any of the questions?
Yeah, very quickly on greening, peace operations and renewable energy. Look, everything is about advocacy, capacity building, and keep it simple with some management structure. Yeah, so we know the people we have, the civilians, we know the TCC, PCC we have in peacekeeping, all right? We know our energy consumption. The takeaway for you from here is what is within UN's control, what is not within UN's control. The UN-owned equipment is under my control as a civilian, yeah? And what are the tools out there? So these are the generators, the fuel. The UN Global Service Center in Brindisi, Valencia, they came up with a field remote implementation monitoring tool where we can put sensors into our generators, look at our fuel consumption, and it's like driving a 30-year-old car versus a brand new car, which says, change my oil, here's a red light, look at my timing belt. Yeah? So if you want to hold us accountable for our environmental footprint, yeah, you need to know what our footprint is and what are the driving factors and how we can reduce it. So what is within the civilians' control is the UN-owned equipment. It's also the behavior of our staff. Are you turning off the electricity? Are you turning off your AC? And are we investing in smart technology? Yes, we are. So we're moving in the right direction. What is not within our control, and I hope member states and think tank will be getting taking note of this, is contingent owned equipment. I will repeat, contingent owned equipment. You look at our consumption of energy, you look at our highest drivers of our budget is fuel, it's diesel generators. Every troop contributing country brings a different model, a different make of their generators. Now, incentives have been provided saying, please bring renewable energy, more environmentally friendly generators, and we will give you some discounts, incentives. It has not worked, yeah? And the political climate that we have to discuss this, it is very challenging, for lack of a better word. Okay, so if you look at our footprint now and the targets set by the Secretary General, are there quick wins? Yes, there are. Renewable energy. What are we talking about? First, for energy consumption, you want to reduce your consumption, increase your efficiency, and invest in renewables. Here at UNMIC, we've done it. Yeah, we bought 27 hybrid vehicles. Sounds great. If you don't drive them after 3 days, you need to jumpstart the battery. And these hybrid vehicles and electric vehicles will not be good in the environments that we are serving in South Sudan, where there is no asphalt, where there is no electricity. Yeah, we have invested in solar panels. We have also, we're so proud of our work that I even paid an external auditor to come in and have a look. And we have the industry standard ISO 14001 environmental management system. But I'm living in a utopian world in Kosovo, in Europe. So what we need to equalize is the playing field. Basically, the policy needs to be clear, the strategy needs to be clear from headquarters, and at the ground, we need to know if we have access and how can we make a difference. So if you want to look at the impact for the POC, yeah, mainstreaming climate security needs to be part of our daily work, just like we have mainstreamed human rights, women, youth issues, child protection issues, and others. All right, and for solar panels, for better technologies, we have worked with headquarters, we have done surveys, and there's now systems contracts in place where missions can go and buy equipment and supplies for quick delivery in the system. Now, I would like to then address very quickly Petit Young's questions. Good to get a question from you, and long time. Regarding analysis, yeah? So currently in peacekeeping, the only ones who are talking about environment and environmental footprint are the operations. Yeah, I'm very inspired by Hazel and her commitment, and that she's been volunteered to co-chair this working group. And I look forward to their best practices and lesson learned, so I can see if we can learn. But again, one size will not fit all. Yeah, and I think it's very important what Florian said exactly. A few years ago, no one was talking about environment. Now we're talking about it. I'm delighted today we're talking about climate security. Now we need to take ownership and educate and do advocacy, capacity building of our people so they can be out there and be the ambassadors with the local communities. Yeah. Now, lastly, on climate change, how can we raise the bar and bring it to the attention of host countries, governments? Now, whoever asked the question, I would sincerely disagree that UN has dropped the ball regarding COVID-19 response. I think the moral leadership authority of the Secretary General is very clear, and WHO is doing an admirable job. And we have stayed and delivered against all challenges, and we stand in solidarity with all humanity on COVID-19. Now, regarding what tools are available that we can do, one of the best practice we had here at UNMIC is large missions, and some missions have programmatic activities budget, yeah, to work either for self-implementing projects, work with the UN partners, or work through civil society organizations and NGOs. 2 years ago, we got together with an NGO, with the EU, with some embassies, CSOs, and we had the first discussion on climate and environment in Kosovo. Then COVID-19 hit. But this is the kind of access to funding that each mission could use, but it's an integrated approach to do advocacy and highlight the issue. Now, what can we do on the ground? We have QIPs, quick impact projects. Yeah, I'm a big believer in the solar panel streetlights. It's the quickest win. Yeah, see what can be done. Ask us the questions. Who's doing this? In which mission? Can we do? Can we work with others towards which plan? Thank you very much.
Thanks, Sandy. Samuel, I'll give you a chance to answer this, and then I think I'm going to use our last 10, 12 minutes to sort of really try and look forward. But if you've got responses to these questions, then Samuel, go ahead.
Yeah, very, very quickly, Elisa. I think in terms of one thing is that for now we focus mainly on climate change more than climate security when it comes to our mandates. And I think what's important is really to use our channels of communication to member states, and one of them is actually the report of the Secretary General that we sent to the Security Council, in which actually we can raise the bar, as Sandy was saying, or raise the alarm on the fact that climate change is increasingly having an impact on security and stability. At least, as I was saying, in our region, actually, it's the case. Second, in response to what Kristen was asking, I think analysis and really ability to conduct proper analysis, data collection, all of this, I think we need to build the capacities of our regional partners, including civil society organization, to make sure that we come up with a common sense of really how to incorporate climate security as a key driver of instability or prevention. Third, I think the entry point that we have. As I was saying earlier, we had this meeting last week with now Gabon is chairing this standing committee on security in Central Africa, and they are entering the Security Council in January for a 2-year non-permanent members seat. And I think what we are doing with them is we're preparing for the October 2022 presidency of the Council by Gabon, and seeing really how when they are chairing the Council, climate can be brought to the agenda of the Council, but with the main security dimension, not climate change as per climate change, but really addressing the impact of climate change on peace and security in Central Africa and by extension in the world. So I think those are the few elements that I wanted to bring here. Thank you.
Thanks for that, Samuel. And you've done an amazing segue into what is my final question, which is, what are some of the entry points and opportunities around climate security for peace operations and crisis management? I mean, I think this, yes, working with Gabon for its presidency in 2022 is timely. I mean, I think for most of you here, you're based in Africa. We're also seeing that the 27th COP is going to be held in Egypt this year. COP maybe isn't the right forum to address climate security broadly, but it should maybe be integrated into that. So I would just be interested to hear from each of you, maybe 2 minutes from each of you. What are the opportunities that you see for and entry points on climate and security? Florian, I'm going to go to you first, if that's okay. Thanks.
Thanks. Yeah, I think the key entry point I mentioned before, right? I'm a deep believer of this link that we need to understand climate action is development and is peace building, and that links also to COP. If we in the analysis that we do on understanding climate security, we focus on climate impacts, how they are translating into people's vulnerability, and how that sort of what pathways that translates into insecurities in a given context. If you think about these 3 items, climate change requires climate mitigation. People's vulnerability is a development and climate adaptation challenge. And the security side is a peace and security challenge, right? We need all of these 3 elements, and they are part and parcel of the whole space that we need to end. And we need to utilize every single one of those entry points, right? Because if we fix one, it doesn't matter, because climate change is still kicking our ass next year, right? we need to get there. The other thing, and that would be my message, I'm fully humble. I'm sitting here in Uppsala, Sweden, in my kitchen, unfortunately, but I know it's difficult in the field. But I think what is really important, and I think that was what Sam also mentioned, is we need to create facts. We need to bring the facts from the ground up, because that makes it difficult. We, as a research institute, can generate facts and scientific evidence and provide this information, but it gets a complete different quality if it comes from missions. We do not need a resolution for that. We don't need anything, right? We just need to do it. And I think that is what we need to do. We need to start doing that. And a lot of you are already doing that actively, but we need more of that, because that in the end will change the dynamics in New York and will change a lot of the things.
Thanks, Florian. And Ngozi.
Yes, thanks for the question. I do agree with Florian. It's about facts. I think it's important to separate those facts into two parts. There's a lot of quantitative research that exists right now. There's just so much heavy research on this, but I think that has to be combined with qualitative research, basically asking those populations who are most vulnerable to climate change, how they perceive of these problems and what the solutions are. So the two types of facts have to go hand in hand. Then I think this idea of partnership cannot be underestimated. I mean, it is so hugely important that for this new factor of climate change, that we really work across both horizontally, within the UN system, but also vertically, so that for us, Sam and I, who are working in regional political offices, that we serve as this bridge between the Security Council at the international level and then regional organizations, national governments, and local communities, because that's the kind of integrated approach that is needed. And to do that, I think there are many ways of, we have established working groups here, but I think there are other ways of doing it too. But I wanted to just give a concrete example of an entry point, just to make it a little bit more accessible to what does it mean to do this integrated approach. So for example, when we started our risk assessment, we came together with organizations like the World Food Programme and FAO and IOM, and we wanted to develop a questionnaire. How do you assess the impact of climate change on security? And already there is very interesting to see. If you're in a political office, you're very much focused on, political representation, dialogue between communities, ethnicity, religion. And then we realized that there's a lot of value. The World Food Programme uses this kind of household survey where they talk much more about the composition of the family, how many meals a day they eat, and IOM will talk about the movement, in and out of certain cities. You need all of this in your methodology, in your toolbox. And unless you come together with other UN agencies to do this, you will not get the full picture. And so I think it's also in response maybe to the question asked by Kristen, that what is needed for political analysis is this integrated approach. And it's a learning experience. And I think this is where the UN, especially UN country teams, have been in the field for such a long time, so that when we connect with them too, to actually make this real action on the ground, real support on the ground for governments, I see us being able to do really important things. Thanks.
Thanks, Ngozi. Samuel, I'm going to turn to you next. I know you've already given us a really good concrete entry point, but do you see any others?
I think, there's a lot of discussions going on, particularly in Africa, on access to climate finance, and the follow-up to the COP26 meeting in Glasgow. I think all of this should also, and we've discussed a lot the role of communities, women and youth, what we should push for, actually, as the UN and UN as secretariat, but also UN agencies, funds and programs on the ground, and EU also, if I can turn to Annette, is to make sure that when addressing those issues of adaptation and compensation, we leave no one behind. I think it's important to make sure that those adaptation strategies take into account the vulnerabilities of the peripheries, because I think those are the one who are suffering. Actually, when we talk about farmer and headers, when we talk about community intercommunal conflict, all of those conflicts happen at the border area, along the border areas where actually government have long ago basically left those communities without any attention, without any presence of the state. So one thing which is important, that the opportunity is really to have a give and take approach, a partnership with the recipient countries and regional organizations, to make sure that we push the agenda of inclusivity and making sure that comes hand in hand with the adaptation strategies. That's what I would have liked to push. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Samuel. Annetta, I'm going to turn to you before I give the last words to Hazel and Sandy from the field.
Thank you. Just to echo what Samuel just said, I think building up or coming from these various lenses, mine of course is also climate sensitive foreign policy. I think without having in my case the EU and member states being much more sensitive to the action, to the factors, to what is necessary. This is definitely something that is a precondition for us then to move into, green economy, green energy, support for not just understanding the triggers, but also trying to not just mitigate, but work against, the potential triggers. And I think this is where I would say EU, the roadmap of climate security defense roadmap to bring this nexus together, but much larger, the multilateral approaches based on a climate sensitive policy that can connect to the RICS. I mean, honestly, if I'm looking at East Africa and the Horn of Africa, we do have, IGAD, basically the old IGAD with double D, coming from a very climate sensitive approach of not just development, but drought. And I think, to bring this back, to bring the awareness back, they have an early warning system and connect it, as we've discussed in the last hour and a half, to connect it and then see what kind of smart innovations are necessary to mitigate and what investment is needed. I think this is for us and the member states, not just to be sensitive, but reacting in this way that is that brings climate change not just as a trigger, but as much more of a forward-looking potential change of energy and resource allocations. That's so far from my side. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Annetta. Sandy? 2 minutes.
Yeah. So let's inspire. Yeah. And if you guys have missed it, go to the UNGA and look at Mia Mottley, the Prime Minister of Barbados, and her speech to the UNGA. I think she spoke her mind at Glasgow as well. I have a confession to make. Yeah, before Tobias lured me into this panel, and I thought I knew what's going on in the UN, I had no idea we had a climate security mechanism established between DPPA, UNDP, and UNEP. Yeah, I repeat, I had no idea. Yeah, and I just looked to see if there's an UNSCAP progress report. That doesn't exist either. Yeah, so looking ahead, let's inspire each other. Let's hold each other accountable. Yeah, let's put our fingers together that the UN Security Council progress will be made for climate security. But if there's any takeaway from here, is that we need to stay together and in touch, and we need to communicate and educate each other and learn from each other. Yeah, but also we need to equalize the playing field. I was very inspired by Ilwat Ewad's opening speech with Almut. Guys, this is our climate. This is our Earth, and we're heading in the wrong direction. It's not only peace operations, it's collective. Yeah, but the most vulnerable is where we are serving, and we do need to continue making a difference. But without just talking, yeah, you think tanks, you governments, member states, you guys need to hold us accountable on the performance indicators we're telling you that we are doing. And you need to hold us accountable as a department and as at the UN, not only as a singular peacekeeping mission. And if we're saying with Hazel that we do not have the money, we will love to do other stuff, we need to be at the table with others, you guys need to be our advocates and talk to us. If there's going to be a special envoy on climate security, yeah, we need to have the best and the brightest there helping that poor gentleman or lady, because there's a lot of hard work to do. But I'm leaving this session with gratitude for the invitation and with inspiration. So thank you very much. And thanks to everyone out there who asked the questions. Thanks.
Thanks, Sandy. And the very last word to you, Hazel.
Oh, wow. I think everything has been said, but a couple of things. I'd like to acknowledge that I've had very good collaboration and support from the climate security mechanism, actually. So there is definitely movement and understanding. I'd like to recognize that I've had very good discussions with Florian and Cedric and all of the others when they started working on the worksheet that you have on climate change and security, because it allows us for those entry points and to start thinking. I would like to say that in terms of entry points, we will have to work with the countries that actually send their troops to Africa. If we do not work with them and you want to green the UN peacekeeping mission, it will not be feasible because they do not have, may not have the actual capabilities to change their contingent own equipment. And I think that to me is a critical thing that will hopefully be addressed with the people in New York, because if we really want to make that change, we have to work with those countries who are actually sending their troops to Africa. So I think that is important. And this is where the conversations in New York will have to be held. And then thinking at the, Samuel, you mentioned about the climate funding. I am not too optimistic. I'm not pessimistic at all, but I'm simply not optimistic that we will see it coming through, because in the country like South Sudan, we will need far more if we want to make a change based on the kind of country that exists, and which is where you have the perfect storm scenario. We have the droughts, we have the flooding, we have the conflict, and we have low capacity that exists, and we're coming out a long civil war of just recent past. And so I really think the reality on the ground speaks to what we need. And I agree with Ngozi about facts, quantitative, qualitative. There's a lot happening, but I want to leave you on a positive note. My colleague in WFP, I will be very brief, informed me about what can we do about not just climate change and security, but adaptation. So the women in a particular state in Warab who are farmers and who've been undertaking sorghum, but given the fact that we've had such recurring droughts, they changed what they planted, and they planted rice. And they were able this year, despite the floods, to have a significant harvest in rice. So I wanted to leave you with that story where it worked to the extent of how we look at what we can do. And I agree with, we just need to sometimes rethink our approaches. And there are quite a bit of changes that we can undertake as long as we talk to each other and with each other. So once again, thanks a lot. I totally appreciate this environment and look forward to seeing all of the upcoming events that will still be taking place. Thank you. Goodbye.
Thanks, Hazel. And we've actually gone over a little bit, so that's all we've got time for. Really want to thank you all the panelists for their great participation, their great interventions. I've really enjoyed it. I think we could have gone on for another hour at least, but I've got to now hand over to Almut to move us on to the next part of the conference. So thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you so much. That has been a really insightful panel with so many knowledgeable people, and is really helpful to learn so much from what is really happening in the field on the ground and sharing your knowledge and advice with us. Elisa, you have done a wonderful job. I know as a moderator, it can be a nightmare to have 6 panelists. Hopefully you had a good night's sleep last night, but you really managed wonderfully. Thank you so much for that. And thank you everyone on the panel, Annette, Gozi, Samuel, Hazel, Sandy, and Florian. Really interesting to listen to you. And yes, for sure, you could go on for quite a while, and hopefully you will be able to join us again tomorrow and the day after. Thank you for this panel. And now I would like to invite everybody for the welcome session to our new partners, the partners in the Challenges Forum, and our new partners are from Uruguay. So we're really looking forward to saying hello to everyone in Montevideo, or whether they might be posted somewhere else. And I would like you to join our virtual welcome session. And in order to do that, please click the link over on your platform. Thank you, and see you over there in a second.